So my name is Sharon Donovan. I'm a professor in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at the University of Illinois, and I also have an adjunct appointment in the Department of Pediatrics. And my research and my teaching focus in the area of pediatric nutrition. It's been a long-term love of mine ever since I was an undergraduate and started learning about human milk and breastfeeding and how that benefits the infant. So let's start with feeding recommendations. I think the first thing to remember about them is that they're evidence-based. So what does that mean? Evidence-based means that we're just not making this up, right? It's just not like what grandma said you should eat your carrots, but what does the scientific evidence tell us about nutrient requirements as well as development of the infants? For example, a lot of the timing of early nutrition is based on how that infant's able to nurse or to eat solid foods. So as I describe the timing, you'll see that that recommendation is tied in many ways to development. So who makes recommendations? So we have a variety of governmental agencies who make recommendations. They will tap experts in the field to evaluate the literature and come up with the best evidence-based recommendations. So we look at the National Institutes of Health, we have the USDA, we have those agencies working together for things like dietary guidelines. Next, I would like to take you through a brief overview of how we should feed infants in the first year of life. And what's important to know is that breastfeeding, so breast milk or infant formula, should be the basis of the nutrition through the first year of life. So the recommendations are exclusive breastfeeding for at least 6 months and then continued for a year. However, if breastfeeding is not available, then we want to have that infant get an infant formula. So around 4 to 6 months, that's when we start to introduce solid foods. So basically solid foods are anything besides a liquid. And again, this is based on when that baby is developmentally mature and they can start to chew and swallow. And we introduce new foods. A lot of times these are baby foods. If you don't have a baby or you haven't had a sibling in a while, next time you're at the grocery store, just take a walk down that aisle and see all the different types of baby foods that are available. And they are staged based on the developmental maturation of that child. So around 4 to 6 months, we begin to introduce the foods. And then as the child gets older, we begin to change the consistency so that around 7 to 8 months, up to 9 to 12 months, you'll start to use things that are chunkier or that the infant can then pick up with their hands as opposed to something that's very pureed. And then typically by about 9 to 12 months, that child should be able to be eating at the table with the family and eating the same foods that the rest of the family is eating. So the recommendations, as I mentioned, is to breastfeed for the first year of life. And currently, the recommendations from the World Health Organization is at 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding. And in the US, we're moving to that as well, which means that the human infant really doesn't need anything else but breast milk for at least the first 6 months. That means water, juice, anything. Breast milk is perfect. What we also recommend is breastfeeding through a year, but even longer if the mother and the infant desire. And so there's really no upper limit, and there's no evidence that there's any harm if the mother and child choose to breastfeed into even the 2nd and 3rd year of life. And why do we recommend breastfeeding? Many of those are improvements in health, reduction in disease. So, for example, breastfed infants have much lower infectious diseases, things like ear infections and diarrhea. So they're much healthier than formula-fed infants. And there's even now studies that show that breastfed infants have higher IQs and have a lower risk of childhood obesity. So the recommendations for solids, again, are to match them with the baby's developmental stage, so starting with purees, pretty small volumes, just 1 to 2 tablespoons at a time, starting with just 1 new food at a time, and then making sure the baby is tolerating that before adding new foods. So up until now, I've really focused on the first year of life. So what do we do after that baby is 1? And the current recommendations are following what we call the My Plate, which is a component of the dietary guidelines for America. And so the My Plate, as you can see, divides the plate into various quadrants. So you have your vegetables and fruits and meats and dairy. And The important things to think about is many of these recommendations are similar to adults. We want to focus on low sugar, low sodium foods. We want to focus on whole grains. We want to focus on low fat foods, but really a lot of variety and high nutrition. The key things to think about in terms of child nutrition is serving size. And we often joke that my plate is flat, right? It's not 3D. So we can't look at it from the side and say, well, how high are those foods stacked up? So one of the things that many parents don't understand is that the serving sizes for kids are very small. So I mentioned with babies, starting at 1 to 2 tablespoons. And so when you look at serving sizes for children, the numbers of servings may be similar to adults, but we're starting with a half a cup of milk, or maybe even a half a slice of bread or a slice of bread. So one of the things that we know that's linked to childhood obesity is that the serving sizes are too big. And so we live in a society right now where everything is supersized, right? And everybody wants the biggest value when you go to the restaurant. But it's important that we teach parents what's an appropriate serving size for their child, and to start by maybe putting that serving size on the plate and then letting the child ask for more. So in addition to making sure that you're serving the child the appropriate amount of food, it's important to think that kids have little tummies. And so because they have little tummies, they probably need to eat more often. So it's not unusual for a toddler, for example, to have 3 meals as well as 2 to 3 snacks per day. But again, you want to make sure that each of those meals and snacks is an appropriate serving size. So it's better to serve smaller, more frequent meals. And that also helps in their appetite regulation, that they don't become too hungry before a meal. But now I'd like to talk a little bit about, well, how are we doing? Because recommendations are one thing, but behavior is another. So on the following slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about the information that comes from some of the studies that have been going on the last 6 to 8 years. And first I want to talk about breastfeeding. So you'll see on the slide I've prepared a chart which compares what are the current breastfeeding rates in 2010 versus what the Surgeon General has recommended in 2020. So what you see is that we have ever breastfed. That means that that baby was breastfed at all. So it could be a month, it could be a week, it could be for a year. And the recommendations are about 82%. And in 2010, we had about 75% of women initiating, and so that's really good. We had met the 2010 requirements, and so we're doing very good in initiating breastfeeding. But then as we look out at 6 and 12 months of age, what we start to see is that the numbers of women breastfeeding starts to fall off fairly quickly. So any breastfeeding at 6 months, we're down to about 44% versus 61%. By a year, we're down to 22% versus the recommended 34%. So these are babies that are getting any breast milk at all. And remember, the recommendation was breastfeeding through the first year of life. But as we look at exclusive breastfeeding, so when we say any breastfeeding, these babies may be getting some breast milk, some infant formula. Exclusive breastfeeding, again, at 3 months, we're only at a 33% versus the recommended 46%. So we're recommending at least almost half of the babies are still exclusively breastfed, but we're down to a third. And then by 6 months, the recommendation is about 26%, but we're only at about 14%. So what we start to see very quickly is that many infants in the US are certainly not exclusively breastfed, and far fewer than we recommend are receiving any breast milk at all. And again, why is that important? It's important because we're starting to see the benefits of breastfeeding. For example, reductions in childhood obesity, reductions in food allergies, and again, the reductions in things like ear infections and diarrhea, which are serious problems in young infants. So part of our education needs to be to promote breastfeeding for the many benefits that it can have for the infant. So let's look then at what happens after, again, the first year of life. And there was a very interesting study called the FITS study, Feeding Infants and Toddlers study. And this was a study where they telephoned parents and asked them basically to do what we call a 24-hour recall, or to describe what their child had eaten in the last 24 hours. And what they found actually was pretty shocking. And it really made people think about, oh my gosh, what are we feeding our children? So I've highlighted some of the key points. So the first is that, again, even as young as 7 months of age, that the babies were showing patterns similar to older children and adults. So this concept that babies aren't little adults wasn't really following through. So they're starting to get things like French fries and fast foods and even sodas. And so another statistic I think that's really important for us to think about is that about 20 to 33% of the infants and toddlers, so these were between the ages of 7 and 24 months, consumed no vegetables, and about 23 to 33% consumed no fruits in a day. So if you think about that, that's not what's recommended for babies or adults. But this is also an important time where the babies are developing their taste preferences and their sense of taste. And so if we're not exposing babies and infants and toddlers to fruits and vegetables, they're not going to grow up to like them. So it's part nutrition, but it's also part of training them to appreciate and like the taste of fruits and vegetables. So we're looking at a very low fruit and vegetable intake, but they also found that French fries were one of the 3 most common vegetables consumed by infants 9 to 11 months of age. And I'll tell you that no nutritionist thinks that a French fry is a vegetable. So 9 to 12, it's one of the 3 most common. By 15 to 18 months, it was the most common vegetable. And if we look beyond French fries, again, vegetable intakes, things like carrots or green beans or squash, was very, very low. So again, this points to the fact that we have a lot of education to do for parents. And this should be done in a way that's very accessible to the parent, because sometimes they just don't know that they need to be feeding their children differently than themselves. As you can see, we're really not getting to the recommended levels. And you may be asking yourself, well, why is this? I think that most person who'd stop on the street, if you'd say, is breastfeeding good, they'd say yes. So a couple of the factors, for example, in the US, a large number of women work outside the home. And once your maternity leave is over, it's difficult sometimes to maintain exclusive breastfeeding. Many women can take pumps to the office and express breast milk that's then fed in a bottle, but it can be hard when you're away from your baby from 8 to 9 hours a day to support that. But what we also know is that in the US, maternity leaves are really, really short. So actually in the US, there's no law that requires maternity leave. There's a law that says it can be 6 weeks, but in most cases, women are using their vacation and sick leave for that maternity leave. If we look at countries, particularly in Scandinavia, where maternity leaves are a year, what we find is that breastfeeding is universal and almost 100%. So there's a direct relationship to maternity leave levels as well as in the incidence of breastfeeding. So that's one of the factors. Also, when women go back to work, sometimes there aren't locations. If a mom is, for example, working on an assembly line, and maybe has a very short break and she doesn't have a place where she can go and express her milk. So there's factors related to work. But there's also just the factors that part of breastfeeding is cultural. And in many cultures around the world, boys and girls grow up seeing, their mother breastfeeding, their aunts breastfeeding, women in public breastfeeding, and it just becomes part of the culture and the expectation. And in the US, that's not always the way. So we have many, young women, for example, who are pregnant, who've never seen somebody breastfeeding. So it becomes something that they need to learn to do. And while breastfeeding is instinctive and natural and as part of our reproductive cycle, it is a learned behavior both on the part of the mother and the infant. So we always recommend, most hospitals have great lactation consultants, and there's also La Leche League, it means the Milk League, you can find them on the internet, and they have 800 numbers. So there's places where women can get support if they are feeling that they're struggling with breastfeeding. So something we never want to make a mom feel guilty about not doing, but we want to make them understand that It's the best thing for their baby. They can learn to do it. It's natural, and most women who do it find it's very satisfying. So I've talked a little bit about the FIT study, which is really looking at food intake in the first 1 to 2 years of life. And I also wanted to bring your attention to another recent study that looked at some of our large-scale food examination surveys. So these are surveys that are done nationally, and they're done over time, which is nice because then we can say, okay, what are people doing differently in terms of their diet than they were doing 10 or 20 years ago? And so this recent study had about 10,000 people that they studied, and what they found is over a 20-year period that on average we were eating about 100 extra calories per day. And this is in young people, 2 to 6 years of age. And so maybe 100 calories doesn't seem like a lot, but in a month's period, you're at an additional 3,000 calories. And if you do that over time, you're going to find that weight gain can start to creep on. And particularly for young children who may only require 1,600 to 2,000 calories a day. So if there's this continual increase in food intake, that's part of the explanation behind why we're seeing more overweight and obese children. And then I think as you look at the types of foods that were contributing to this increase in calories, it's, again, many of the typical things we might expect. So sugars and what we call solid fats. So these would be animal fats, so fats that are solid at room temperature, butters, lards, things like that, not oils. Savory snacks, pizza and calzones, mixed Mexican dishes, sweet snacks and candy, and fruit juice. So these were the top foods that changed per capita between 1989 and 2008. So again, you can see a lot of these foods are very commonly consumed not only by 2 to 6 year olds, but also by college students, pretty much across the spectrum. So just to finish up, I'd like to just finalize a couple bullet points about things to consider about feeding recommendations. Breastfeeding for the first year of life, ideally exclusively for 6 months. Offering that variety of fruits and vegetables to kids, again, starting at about 4 to 6 months, but continuing throughout their life. But as we know, this early period of time is really important in developing taste preferences and their ability to accept foods. Offer desserts, sweets, sweetened beverages, and salty snacks only occasionally. We're kind of in this culture right now where dessert is something that people have after every meal almost, but certainly almost every night. And so rather than it becoming a treat, it's become sort of an expectation. But thinking about, other foods, even like a yogurt or, maybe a juice, but not one that's 100% juice, or a piece of fruit, having a banana, which is sweet rather than an ice cream. So we know that, as I mentioned, that the intake of these types of foods has been what's been driving up calorie intake. And really the recommendations for kids now is that breast milk, but then after that, water, milk, or 100% fruit juice are the only things that kids should be consuming. I hate to say, sometimes we see Coca-Cola in a bottle, and not only in the US, but internationally, but really water is important, and what we find in the US is people don't drink enough water, but then milk and 100% fruit juice if they're going to have juice at all. But again, juice should be sparing. It's much better to have them eat a real piece of fruit because that way they get to chew on it and it's a lot more filling. And then the last point, which again will be reiterated in other lectures, is that family food choices influence the child. The parent's really the role model. And so, the family meals and the parent showing the child what is a healthy food. So if dad isn't eating broccoli and mom's saying to the child, eat your broccoli, they may say, well, daddy's not eating it, why should I have to eat it? So part of, getting parents to be a good role model for your child is only going to improve your own nutrition.